Hi, and welcome back to the Eldritch Hearth. I know it has been a hot minute since I've been here, but I have a case that I hope will make it worth the wait. On November 13th, 1974, Ronald Defeo Jr. went into the bedroom of each of his family members and shot and killed them as they slept. That crime, committed at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, Long Island, New York, spawned 29 movies and several books. But let's go back to the beginning and talk about Ronald. Ronald was born on September 26, 1951 in New York. When he was 14 in 1965, the family bought the new home on Ocean Avenue and moved into it. The home was named High Hopes. And the rest of his family was Ronald Defeo Sr., known as Big Ronnie, Louise Bercante Defeo, and his four younger siblings, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew. Big Ronnie was known for having a temper, and he in fact began physically abusing Ronnie Jr. when he was only 18 months old. In school, Ronnie was an overweight child who also had a brooding, grumpy demeanor, and this led to him being the focus of much bullying. Between the bullying at school and the abuse he faced at home, Ronnie developed his father's temper. Ronnie was expelled from several schools because of his violent outbursts. The family tried taking him to therapy, but he wanted no part of it. When he was expelled again at the age of 17, his father bought him a $14,000 speedboat in hopes of making him feel better. Ronald began working at his grandfather's used car dealership. Michael Bercante was rumored to have ties to the mob. And Big Ronnie was the nephew of Peter Defeo, who was a captain in the Vito Genovese mob family. During his trial, several of his friends testified that he had pointed a gun at them, but they thought, it's just Ronnie. The police knew him fairly well. He had been picked up recently on a charge of stealing an outboard motor and was on probation for the crime. He'd gotten into an argument with his father afterward, and he picked up a loaded shotgun and pointed it at his father's head. He pulled the trigger twice, but the gun misfired. On November 1st, 1974, Ronald Defeo Jr. staged a burglary with money from his grandfather's used car dealership. He reported to the police that not only had the money from the dealership been stolen, but also some of his own money as well, as he was on his way to the bank to deposit them. His father figured out what was going on, and Ronald confessed to the crime. The two men got into many violent and angry arguments over this crime in the days leading to the murder. On the morning of November 13th, 1974, Ronnie showed up to work extra early that morning, around 6:30 a.m. Around 7 a.m., someone found him sleeping in his car and woke him up to get started on the day. At 8:40 a.m., Caroline O'Reilly pulled up into the driveway of the DeFeos, intending to pick up the children to take them to school. Both Ronald Sr. and Louise's cars were in the driveway, and when Caroline went to the door, no one answered her knocks. She drove her children to school and returned a little later to knock again and check to see if the children needed a ride, but again, no one answered. No one at the car dealership worried where Big Ronnie was because his son Mark had been in a football accident and he required both crutches and a wheelchair and was going to physical therapy for this. And so that day was a physical therapy day for Mark, so Big Ronnie had informed the dealership that he wouldn't be into work that day. Ronald Jr. left work at some point and spent several hours with his girlfriend, and then he hung around with another friend before going to Henry's Bar, which was a regular hangout of his about a block from the home on Ocean Avenue. He had a few drinks and then returned home. A short time later, he burst back into the bar yelling, "You've got to help me! I think my mother and father were shot!" Three of his friends and another bar patron followed him back to his home to check on the situation. Ronald Jr. refused to enter the house. Two of the friends went into the house, went upstairs, and found the bodies of Ronald Defeo Sr., aged 43, and Louise Defeo, also aged 43, shot in bed. The friends came back downstairs, and one of them called 911 to the Suffolk County Police Department. A police officer arrived a short while later and went upstairs to determine, yes, indeed, there were two people shot in their beds. He also checked the bedrooms of the two boys, Mark and John Matthew, and found that both of them had also been shot while they slept. The police officer went back outside, upon which Ronald Jr. informed him he also had two sisters, and the officer went back up the stairs and found the 2 bodies of the young women. All 6 bodies were lying face down in their beds. They had been shot with a .35 caliber lever-action Marlin 336C rifle. Ronald Jr. told the police that he believed it could be the work of mob hitman Louis Fellini. The police took him into custody, not only to get his statement, but also to protect the last surviving member of the Defeo family. Around 24 hours later, Ronald Defeo Jr. confessed to the murders of his parents and his 4 siblings. Dawn was 18, Allison was 13, Mark was 12, and John Matthew was just 9. After his initial confession, he changed his story several times, once claiming that Dawn had been responsible for the murders and he killed them in response to her killing the other members of the family. He also accused his mother of the crime. Members of the community were not surprised to see that Ronald Defeo had committed such a violent act. He showed police exactly where he had hidden the rifle and the bloody clothing after the act. His trial began on October 14, 1975, and he was defended by William Weber. Weber was pleading an affirmative defense of insanity. He also claimed that the confession was inadmissible. Part of Ronald's testimony was that he had killed his family in self-defense because he had heard their voices plotting to kill him. He admitted that he had been shooting heroin daily in the days up to the act. The only motive the prosecutions could suggest was that he had inquired about receiving a $200,000 life insurance payment at the police department when he had been brought there shortly after his family's deaths. There is some mystery about how exactly he was able to kill all the members of his family without any of them struggling to get away. He did not use a silencer, and though in the beginning it was believed that he had given the family sedatives to keep them asleep, upon the autopsies, it was determined that there was absolutely no sedatives in their blood at all. Only 2 members of the family showed signs that they had been awake when the attack occurred. Louise was not shot in the back as the rest of the family was. It appeared that she woke up to the shots, attempted to move, and was shot twice in the side, and then died. Allison's blanket and body was also in a position that would lead one to believe that she had also been awake. While the defense attorney testified that he believed that Ronald was not responsible for the acts because he was not in charge of his faculties at the time, the prosecution psychiatrist had a very different diagnosis. He diagnosed Ronald Jr. with antisocial personality disorder, which is marked by a lack of empathy, emotional problems, self-centeredness to an abnormal degree, and a tendency to rely on deception, lying, and cheating. It took the jury 2.5 days of deliberations to come back with a conviction of guilty. Ronald was convicted on November 21, 1975, with 6 charges of second-degree murder. An interesting note, at that time in New York State, charges of first-degree murder were reserved for those who had killed a police officer. After the murders in November of 1974, the house remained vacant until December 18th of 1975, when George and Kathy Lutz and Kathy's 3 children moved into the home. The 5-bedroom Dutch colonia with a swimming pool and a boathouse seemed a bargain for them at $80,000, and so they jumped on it. They even got all of the Defeo's furniture as part of the deal for only an additional $400 more. But on January 14th, 1976, 28 days later, they moved, leaving everything they owned behind. They held a press conference discussing the haunted and ghostly events that had happened to them while they remained in the home. The Lutzes claimed that green slime had oozed from the walls. There was a red-eyed, pig-faced demon and a little ghost girl named Jody that the youngest child, Melissa, had talked to. They claimed that a priest who had come to bless the house had been told to get out and had been attacked by some kind of entity within the house. They claimed that furniture moved around by itself, that Kathy had floated above the bed and turned into an old hag. The story of their 28 Days of Terror was written into a book by Jay Anson and called The Amityville Horror, and was released in September of 1977. A movie about the book, starring James Brolin and Margot Kidder, was released in 1979. Now, before we get into talking about what was real about the Amityville Horror, let's talk about the Lutzes. George Lee Lutz was born on January 1st, 1947, so when the events of the book happened, he was 28 years old. He was a former Marine working at his family's surveying office. Kathleen Teresa Connors Lutz was born October 13th, 1946. She had recently divorced her husband, Sebastian Coratino, and with him she had had 3 children: Daniel, age 9, Christopher, age 7, and Melissa, or Missy, who was 5. They had married in July of 1975, and while they had each had their own home, they wanted to buy one together that would be theirs. I'm not going to speak to the events of what happened in those 28 days yet, but I do want to give you some additional information for the Amityville horror timeline. In February of 1976, about a month after the family left the home, the Lutzes held a joint press conference with the attorneys for Ronald Defeo Jr., including William Weber. They said that their experiences in the house could impact his appeals. In giving an account of his 28 days in the house, George Lutz said to the reporters, and I quote, this is important, "There were no human shapes, no flying objects, no wailing, no moving couches." 5 months later, in July of 1976, the story had completely and utterly changed and began to involve all of the elements that we now know and think of as part of the Amityville horror. After the book came out, George and Kathy Lutz sued several people for writing stories about their experiences, and they also sued DeFeo's lawyer, William Weber. They were basically accusing him of libel for telling people that what they said wasn't true. Weber sued them right back, and the case went to court, in which Weber testified, "I know this book is a hoax. We created this horror story over many bottles of wine." And George testified that the story was mostly true. The presiding judge, Judge Weinstein, eventually said, "It appears to me that to a large extent the book is a work of fiction." The Lutzes case was dismissed by the judge, and Weber's was settled. The Lutzes agreed to pay for his attorney's fees, and that was the end of it. Now, let's talk about the events, and let's debunk them. Father Ralph J. Picaro testified in that court case that he did in fact visit the house to bless it, that he did hear a voice saying "get out," but he had had no other supernatural experiences in the house, nor did he have more contact with the family. In the book, the Lutzes claimed to have found out from the Amityville Historical Society that where the house was built was where the Shinnecock Native American tribe had abandoned their mentally ill and dying members. They also said that John Ketchum was someone who had come from Salem, Massachusetts, and had been expelled from the town for witchcraft. He then moved to Amityville, built upon the site of 112 Ocean Avenue, and began sacrificing Native American and others to Satan. Both the Lutzes and the Warrens, Ed and Lorraine, claimed that this was the origin of the horrors that had happened in the house. However, the Shinnecock tribe did not live where their house was. They actually lived to the east of Amityville. Where the house was located had been the Massapequas tribe, and they had done nothing like that on the site. There was also no record of a John Ketchum ever living at that location or pretty much any other location in Amityville. There was a John Ketchum from the Massachusetts area, and his descendants did come to the Amityville area and settle there. That's why several of the streets in the town are named after them. However, there are no records anywhere suggesting that any of them were Satanists. But let's go back to the Warrens for a minute. Let's talk about it. In March of 1976, Ed and Lorraine Warren came to do a full investigation at the Amityville house. Reporter Marvin Scott was part of the team who participated. He has said that absolutely nothing happened that night. It was one of the most boring nights of his life, in fact. He said it was scarier being in the theater watching the Amityville horror with a bunch of pot-smoking teens. But what the Warrens said, Lorraine said, while sitting in the sewing room with Marvin, she turned to him and said, "Marvin, this is the closest to hell I ever want to get." And Ed, he said if haunted houses had a scale of 1 to 10, this was a 10. The famous Ghost Boy picture was supposedly taken on this night. However, it didn't appear or wasn't released to the public until the movie was coming out. I'll admit the photo definitely looks creepy, but there are several reasons why that photo could have been taken or even faked. One of the most famous events from the Amityville horror is the red-eyed demon that Kathy and George saw on the roof. Well, the neighbors had a Siamese cat, and Siamese cats' eyes glow red in the dark. This cat was known to climb the roof. In fact, the people who bought the house after the Lutzes said that it had scared them several times when they had seen it on the roof. In the book, the Lutzes say that whenever anyone visited their home, they immediately became angry and aggressive. However, a friend and his wife visited the home 2 weeks after the Lutzes had moved in, and the friend's wife had this to say: "I wouldn't be in as good of a mood as Kathy if I was the one living there after those murders happened," implying that Kathy was in a really good mood while they were there. The mysterious red room that they didn't discover until a few weeks into their stay was actually disclosed in the realtor's papers. It was where the pipes went through. George claims that there was a full moon that night. It was the last quarter of the moon. He claims he saw cloven hoof prints in the snow. There was no snow that night. They claim to have called the cops. The cops say it didn't happen. They claim that they called the church. The church says, nope, we didn't hear from them. Jim and Bob Comarty moved into the house after the Lutzes had fled, and they said there was absolutely nothing supernatural in the house whatsoever. They had no uncomfortable experiences whatsoever, and Barb said she was very happy in the house and hoped to remain there for the rest of her life. However, all of the curiosity seekers forced the family to actually move out of the home for a time, and they only lived there for a few more years before moving. Subsequent owners have also said they have experienced nothing supernatural in the house. Its windows have been changed so that it no longer has that distinctive appearance, and its address has been changed from 112 Ocean Avenue to 108 Ocean Avenue. George and Kathy did take polygraphs around the time that the movie was released, and it was found that they were truthful in what they were saying. And the oldest boy, Daniel, who did change his name to Lutz, came out with a documentary called My Amityville Horror, where he disclosed his version of events from that time period. He says that George was incredibly strict. He also said that George was fascinated by the occult and attempted to summon spirits during their time there. And he feels that's what caused all of the events. Daniel says 100% things that the book claims, that's what they lived through. The second son, Christopher, has a very different story. While he agrees with his brother that George did dabble in the occult, and he said there were a few mysterious things that happened during that time, it was nothing like what happened in the book or the movie. He said, George is a professional showman who dabbled in the occult and then exaggerated the incidents to make money. I feel as though we were just exploited. George Lutz died of a heart attack on May 10th, 2006. Right after he had lost another lawsuit suing the 2005 Ryan Reynolds movie version of Amityville Horror. He and Kathy had divorced in the late 1980s, and she died of emphysema on August 17th, 2004. Ronald Defeo Jr. continued bringing up more and more appeals, and each time he came up with a different story of how the murders occurred and how he had not been the one to commit them. He had remained in contact with reporter Marvin Scott, the one who had attended the Warrens' seance in the house. And in a letter after the movies came out and all of the books, he said, "There was no demon. You know who the demon was. I am the demon." Ronald Defeo Jr. died on March 12th, 2021. So what do you think? Was Amityville haunted? I'm curious. Let me know in the comments. This ends this episode of The Elder Hearth. And Hob the Skull and I would like to invite you to come back next time. We hope you do attend.